All right. Good evening. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Yes, that's right. We are turning 50 this year. We are very, very, very excited. You can come back and celebrate with us November 2nd through the 9th. The election is on November 5th. We figure either way, we're going to need a party. So come hang out with us. We're very excited to be here to celebrate the debut of Brea Baker, her book, Rooted: The American Legacy of Land Theft and the Modern Movement for Black Land Ownership. This is a very important book. We're glad that friends and family are here, both in person and online. And we're very glad to be here with one of our faves, Nic Stone, to be the interviewer. Yes, one of y'all's faves too, I'm sure. Nic Stone is the author of so many books that if I read them all, we're not going to have time to talk. So I'm not going to do that, but they're all good. Nic Stone stays busier than almost anyone I know. And certainly you have heard of the #1 New York Times best-selling book, Dear Martin, and so many other incredible, important books that have represented real life to young kids and teens, and she continues to do that, and we are so grateful and excited. She's also a Spelman graduate, an Atlanta native, so represent. And Brea Baker is now an Atlanta resident, and you're basically a native after 5 years, so we'll count you. Yes, yes. That's right. That's right. She has been working on the front lines for more than a decade. She believes deeply in nuanced storytelling and Black culture to drive change, and she has commented on race, gender, and sexuality for Elle, Harper's Bazaar, Refinery 29, Them, and more. Her writing has been featured in the anthologies Our History Has Always Been Contraband and No Justice, No Peace. A Yale alumna, Baker has been awarded and recognized as the 2017 Glamour Woman of the Year, a 2019 ID Up and Rising, and a 2023 Creative Capital Awardee. She has spoken at the United Nations Girl Up Initiative, Yale Law School, the Youth to Youth Summit in Hong Kong, the Museum of the City of New York, and elsewhere. We're very honored that you are speaking here. I'm very glad to have everybody with us watching online. We want to let you know that you can ask questions at any time in the chat. And for y'all who are here, I'm going to bring a mic around to you when it's time to ask questions. I know that maybe seems silly in this small, intimate room, but it's so that the folks who are online can hear you when you speak. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Nic Stone, and we're going to get right into it. Thank you all. Put your hands together. First of all, yes.
Girl, hold on. Okay, so I feel like most of the people in the room know you already.
A good amount. I'm not gonna lie. It feels good to see so much family and friends. And those who are not, we will leave family or friends.
I love it. I love it. So for the people online, right? I want you to talk, because I'm sure there are a lot of people online who are tuning in who don't know you. I want you to talk a little bit about what made you decide to choose a very specific type of violence with your debut book. Debut book. And when I say choosing violence, what you do with this book, it rips through a number of paradigms that most of us don't even know we believe in, right? You unravel and unpack things that we have been especially in the Black community, we have been deeply conditioned to ignore.
Yeah.
So tell us all why you decided on this book to shift from your essays to a longer text.
Yeah. Ooh, I like that question. Because I like the idea of choosing violence.
Yes.
I think for me, I was on my own unlearning and relearning journey. And then instead of preaching at people about that journey, it felt better to just invite people along for the things that I was already reconsidering, because I grew up in Long Island, New York, in the suburb of a very large city, and my life really revolved around that sort of urban environment. And so the idea of me being someone who has chickens and, you know, a backyard with raised garden beds and all of the other things that we engage in, or even being a resident of the South, are things that I didn't ever see for myself because of all of the paradigms and myths and things that you just mentioned. Just having a lot of shame around the South that you don't even recognizing, having a lot of shame around agriculture that you don't always recognize. And I think, especially once I got into activism, there's like a story sometimes that young activists tell ourselves that we are a generation that is doing something that hasn't been done before, or I'm not like my ancestors or my elders, but in a way that feels like I'm speaking down on. And I think I went through a phase where I thought I was the activist of the family in a way that felt like new to the family. And it was because I was really dismissing what activism in the South has looked like and activism in rural areas has looked like. And I had to honor that and almost like apologize to my elders for whom I didn't realize all that they were up against. And so didn't know to appreciate all that they had held on to for us. And once I did appreciate that, in some ways it was a little too late because my grandfather, Alfred Baker, had already passed away, but I still had my grandmother with me and so many family. And it felt like, well, first before I even wanted to write a book that other people would buy, I really just wanted to record this for my family. And then the more I talked about it, the more I just felt like, well, we're not that special. Like, I mean, we the bomb, but we're not the only Black family dealing with this sort of dynamic. And I wanted to connect what the Bakers in North Carolina and the Carters in Kentucky had experienced and how that shaped or reflects a lot of Black families.
I want you to say a little bit more about what activism in the South looked like, because I do think, you know, we are in a very interesting time, to say the least. Did y'all watch the debate though?
Pretending I didn't.
Listen, oh, wow. And we're also in a time where there's a lot of pushback against diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives that were started in 2020 after the death of George Floyd. And you are so right about the past 4 to 5 years specifically have given us a very specific, narrow view of what activism is. I want you to talk a little bit more about the activism that you are revealing in Rooted.
Yeah. So to tell that, I will say that when my grandfather was alive, he often spoke of his father as someone who let things happen to him. He let white people take his land. He let insert. And he had all these reasons why his father should have done differently, could have done differently, but didn't, and how he would have done better. And what I think my grandfather didn't always know, especially when he was a teenager who was fleeing the South, was just how much his dad was up against, just how much any Black landowner in the South was up against. And so the activism that I'm talking about is one, just the survival, because we say those words now, but to really think of what it meant to have something that no one near you wanted you to have, and to know that they felt that they deserved it more than you, and you had to hold on to that, whether that was through self-defense and like arming and protecting your family. That was a form of activism. But also, you know, defying the social norm of the time as a Black person who had a lot to lose was its form of activism. Registering to vote in the South was subject for a lot of sharecroppers to be both evicted and fired. So you lost your house and your job because your boss is also your landlord. So there was so much power that was consolidated in the same hands that any one wrong move could lead to the end of the life that you and your family know. And to continue to register to vote, to continue to buy more land, knowing that having even 1 acre was enough to make people nearby, you'd be like, why do that? You know, like to invite, like it was inviting a jealousy and an envy that you couldn't always control. And still they did it, hoping to pass something on to the next generation. And that activism too, like passing on an inheritance in a country that once treated us as property and that has never wanted us to own, let alone have something to give to a note generation. So all of these things are activism. And I didn't always see it, but I also think that there's a way that we frame certain forms of activism as like passive when we don't acknowledge the context of the time. So there was a part of me that thought that family members, that they were just, you know, keeping their head down to get by, and that wasn't activism. When again, I mean, just knowing that we owned more land over 100 years ago than we do now. So any Black person who owns land now is like a unicorn in that way, especially rural farmland. Like less than 1% of US farmland is owned by Black people. So a family like ours, a family like this, like, it's so special to see Black people that, in spite of everything designed to take everything they'd ever dreamed of, still had something, even if it's not all that it should have been, still have something to pass on, is so miraculous. But I don't even want to call it miraculous, because that's to deny all the work that it took to keep it in the family. How diligent you had to be, how on top of your property taxes, how you had to be just constantly watching and knowing everyone, keeping your enemies close, but smiling still, not being able to ever express your anger fully, like all of that. Thinking that I have it better when I get to go out in my activism and yell anything I want to yell and know that I'm going home that night, right? So like, it's just very different. And it's not to downplay the activism that we do. Like student activists across encampments and universities have taken on so many stakes, but most of us activists, even the times when I have been arrested in civil disobedience, I knew that I was going to make certain bail and get out at a time, because it has been systematized for me, because other activists took deeper, realer risks. And so I think that's definitely something that I had to name and honor.
Whew, yeah. And I think one of my favorite things was about the book, the fact that you did the book. I'm blown away by it, largely because to publish a book like this at a time like this, when we are, yes, we can go and shout, but I think that frequently we forget all of the insidious ways that people can come behind us. Yeah, right?
That's true.
But what you highlight in this book is that it kind of came to me yesterday when I was reading, like, every area of privilege is an area of weakness, right?
Ooh.
In addition to that, every area of underprivilege that an individual has had to overcome creates an advantage. And I'm reading your book, and this is coming to me, right? Because in overcoming underprivilege and disadvantage, we're learning to navigate a system that people who are privileged take for granted. I want you to talk a little bit more about how your grandfather managed to take back what belonged to you. Take is the wrong word, but you understand what I'm saying.
Absolutely. Take back, reclaim, all of the things. But I love that idea. I think Toni Morrison said something similar, or maybe someone brilliant and Black said something really amazing about,
such as yourself, just saying.
Thank you. But said something about the idea that Black people have had to know white people better than they've known themselves.
That part right
because
there.
We've had to master their shifts in moods and
standards,
pivot our own responses, all of that. And I think that is something that comes true when I think of the way that my grandfather navigated land ownership, because in our family, he had seen his father and his grandfather kind of go through this like yo-yo with land ownership, where at birth they inherited land, they try to add more to it, they end up having to put some up for collateral and lose some and spend a lot of their life trying to get it back. And I think he saw that. And the main things, he was just like, you can't give whiteness, whoever the powers that be, you can't give them any excuse, which is a challenge, because that same thinking has Black people thinking we have to be twice and 3 times as good, and it burns us out and it's exhausting. But it's true. He'd just on a random Tuesday be like, you know what, I'm going to drive down to the tax office and see which of my family members owes some taxes. And then he'd pay their taxes on the spot and then drive to their house and be like, you know, you owe taxes, right? I paid it, but you better pay it next time yourself. And like, he was very vigilant about making sure that no one was going to lose their land the same way that we had in the past. I think other things that he did really intentionally was just make sure that his children and grandchildren cared about the land as much as he did. Because when we hear these stories of, oh, someone sold grandma's house and they didn't know how much it was worth and blah, 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 blah. I think it's harder to sell something when you actually do know the worth, like, and when the worth is more than just this dollar amount that an appraiser gave you, but when you know the value of land because we have memories here. Like my grandfather and my great grandfather walked this land, and I don't need to know exactly which part, but like some of these trees have been here since they've been here. You know, our Aunt Sarah has a plant that was passed down to her from our great grandma Martha that my great grandma Martha died when she was in the 1970s. And that plant is still living and going, and like being able to say like, oh yeah, it's been growing for decades and we have been stewarding that plant. We have kept that plant alive. Sorry, I keep hitting this. But I think that those things are so powerful and help us hold on to something beyond that. And I remember when my grandfather was on his deathbed, one of the last things he said was, don't sell the land. And when I interviewed my father and his siblings, and they're just all like, there's no question. Like, there's no offer anyone could give us that it's priceless to us. And the more that we see anything that has been passed down to us as this priceless heirloom that is worth, whether that's a story, whether that's land, whether that's a business, whether that's a dream, like it's worth maintaining and holding on to. I think that is so meaningful, and it allows us to keep the continuity. So my hope is to teach him how to love the land, and that Mariah can, that we teach him together how to love the land enough that when he grows older, we don't even have to say it. He just knows. My job is to pass this on to the next generation, not to squander it in my lifetime, and to be as vigilant as I need to be to do that, and to give myself grace when things happen that are not in my control.
Yeah. I want you to give us all, the people in this room and the people watching, give us a little bit of advice when it comes to maintaining intergenerational relationships. Because I find that with the way technology functions right now, it quite literally creates a divide between generations, right? Like, my mama got a cell phone like a year ago, bro. Like, stop. She held out. Like, if I wanted,
you had to call her landline.
I had to call her at whichever job she was at, whichever work, and I got used to just not being able to get in touch with her, right? So she has taken on this cell phone, and now she's trying to like navigate different things. But the speed at which things change, it creates a really unfortunate divide, I think.
It does.
How do we get better at maintaining our relationships with the ancestors that we still have access to?
Man, that's so real. I mean, even in our life, because I think of myself as, I'm a younger millennial, I feel technologically savvy, but even I imagine like the way that AI and the metaverse are ballooning, and I'm like, oh, by the time he's like in school, he's going to be doing assignments in like Roblox, and I'm not going to know how to meet him at all where he's at. But it really is I think part of it is that younger generations have to acknowledge that technology can't be the only bridge. And I feel lucky to be of like one of those last generations that still had a little bit of both. Like, I didn't get social media till college. And I had, my cousin Dana's here. And so I'm going to bring your dad into the space. Because when I think of even like long before I was writing a book, we'd have family reunions and her dad would say, go. And we knew, may. And that was sit down and hear a story about your elders. And like, that doesn't happen anymore, or it can't happen on Zoom. Like, that can't happen on Zoom when Uncle Bruce wouldn't have even known how to take off mute or not. You know what I mean? He deserved the space to have us sit at his feet and be deferent. And I think that there's not as much of an appreciation for that. And we try to race past things and like Google it. And like, some answers are not Googleable, and they shouldn't be. We have to like sit with people who know more than us and hear from them. And so, Uncle Bruce, we'd sit at the family reunions, and then after the family reunion, he'd mail us a manila envelope with printed out worksheets of things that we needed to be working on until the next reunion. And we loved that. My sister, like we loved that. He would teach us phrases in Swahili from his travels, and he'd teach us about family stories. And I think it has to start in that way, and it has to be normalized, because even when I wanted to be playing kickball, and I was like, Uncle Bruce, it's my turn and I'm ready to kick. But now it's so priceless because I had those moments with him. And by the time I got old enough, I started recording them and I started documenting and taping them. And I think we have to get back to those spaces, which, at a certain age, a young person is not going to carve out for themselves. We have to get back to the family reunions and the big intergenerational gatherings. And there's this LA Times article that talks about how at one point, the US was one of the most age diverse societies. We lived, worked, and played with people of all generations. And now we're one of the most age segregated societies, because it is abnormal for families of multiple generations to still be living together and learning from each other and playing together and whatnot. But again, I think it is something that we can take into our hands. So to continue to use my son as an example, every Sunday, Davis spends time with his grandparents and his great grandparents. And that is so special. And so like, you can't trade that out for anything else. There's nothing else he could be doing at that time that's more valuable than hearing those stories. And hopefully we'll record enough that one day he'll get to watch videos of insert story of those who are not here. His grandpa Alfred, his grandma Janelle, his uncle Bruce, his aunt Ann, his aunt Tina. And I think that we have to make the time for our elders, because there's so many times when I was writing this book that I was like, if grandpa was still alive, he'd have the answer to everything. But Uncle Ed and Aunt Sarah and so many others were still here. And it just made me feel that much more of an urgency around someone's got to talk to them. Mm-hmm. And if I call them with only 15 minutes, you know, and like, sorry, I got to go. Like, that's not enough time. Like, I don't call my elders unless I know I got time, because I know you're going to keep me on the phone, and that's okay. And that's okay. I'm ready for it. Mm-hmm. Like Uncle Bruce, I could not call him if I didn't have a free evening. I can't have dinner plans, nothing. I call at 11 a.m. and we still on the phone at 6. I'm like, Uncle Bruce, I just wanted to know what grandpa's middle name was, but we're still here. Okay. But it matters. It's so special. So I think we have to make time for that. And then there are ways to bridge technology and FaceTime and Zoom, but that has to be the complement, not the foundation. I feel like we just need in-person time, and not just with our elders, with each other. Yes. Like I think COVID-19 really proved how lonely we can all get and how much we crave touching, hugging, facial expressions, body language, all of the things that you can't really replace on a weak Wi-Fi connection.
Yeah. Just bars. there and there and there. Like, okay, I have 3 questions left, and then I'll open up for audience questions. So one of the things that I loved about Rooted is that you took us on this journey that wove in really ugly history, but you left us with so much hope.
Thank you.
Right? I'm trying not to cry. I don't like you. You are.
I love you.
Jeez. Woo. The world is changing. However, reading a book like yours makes me feel like even though it is changing, and even though it's changing in these really fast ways that are really difficult to keep up with, there is something so beautiful and powerful about the interpersonal connections that you're talking about right now, right? How do you see us as a species moving closer together as a result of the way the world is changing? I know that's kind of like a complicated question, but I think
that's real. I mean, there's so many ways to go. Well, first of all, there is a really great film critic named Brooke Obie, and she coined something called, I think, the Walker-Hurston test, because in Alice Walker's introduction of Barracoon, she talked about how Zora Neale Hurston will always give you the truth, and it's hard, but then she'll give you the medicine right after. She never leaves you in your hurt and in your pain. And I thought that was really important, is not to write a book that makes Black people feel really sad and dejected and just like everything is horrible, but we deserve to feel optimistic and excited about something, because we're bringing children into the world. And if we don't feel hopeful about something, then what are we doing any of this for? And so when it comes to, I think I lean into the idea that we have studied white America so well that we've tried to beat them at their own game. And there's no winning capitalism for Black people.
There is no winning capitalism.
Like there's no, really, right, for anyone. But yeah, especially for us, there's no, like, I'm going to do it the best and then I'm going to win. You can always have it that pulled from under you. And I think that's an important lesson that we learn from the Tulsa massacres and from, people who've just lost so much of their wealth and their dreams and everything that their families have worked for. And I think what that teaches me is that instead of trying to play white America's game, we should lean into what we have always been successful at, which is collectivism, which is trusting and leaning on each other, which is we own land together. It's a family operation. It serves the community. If I have too much food, then my neighbors are going to have food. And I think that we can lean into those things more than ever now because we can't trust the government to do that for us. And I think that people started to realize that again during COVID-19. And I think crises and pandemics really expose how bad things are for us. But mutual aid, like people leaned all the way in on mutual aid during the pandemic when they realized, oh, people have lost their jobs and the government said one check, that's it. And the only way to get through that is community fridges and crowdsourcing and crowd funding and all of these things. And I think that's going to happen now too. So for example, like, I mean, Mariah hates when I say that we're farmers. I think we're farmers. She says we ain't legit enough to be farmers, but we have a small little operation. We've got 8 chickens and some raised garden beds. And whenever there are extra eggs, I love getting to give them away. Yeah. And after our family have gotten some, then it's like, all right, well, our neighbors. And after our neighbors, I remember I was on the book tour and I was just talking to Mariah and she's like, oh yeah, the Orchid Man came today. I gave him a dozen eggs because we have too many. And I love those versions of supporting each other, that he went to work and not only made his, but like he came home with some eggs and was able to tell his wife, like, you've got eggs from the Bakers and
right out the chickens.
Exactly. Right out the chickens, just out the, keep my language right. But yeah, and I think that we can do those things more. We can lean on each other and support each other. And, I know my neighbor needs something as simple as some eggs or sugar or whatever. That used to be normal to go to your neighbors asking for those things. And now we barely know each other. And I think the more that we know each other, the more we trust each other with things like this, the more that we trust each other with our dreams and with our fears and to look out for us when we are most afraid. But especially in the time that's coming, no matter where this election goes. I mean, we saw how January 6th went. So we can win and that still is not going to immediately be a win. And yeah, we can win and that not immediately be a win because what is that party doing for any of us? So, right. I mean, there's a lot of ways that things will be disappointing come November, but I think when we know that the person to my left and the person to my right, the person in front of me, the person behind me cares enough to be just on the lookout and vice versa, I think we will find a lot more to live and be hopeful for. And again, the little ones, the kids, it's just like, what world are we leaving for them? And what is the quality of the food, the air, the water that we're leaving behind? And if we don't care about who owns the land and what they do with it, our kids are going to be dealing with a lot more health issues a lot earlier on than even our generations are, which is happening at a more rapid pace. So I think it's that sense of urgency that keeps me being like, there has to be another way. And my ancestors lean to other way. Like our great-great-great-grandfather, or y'all's great-great-grandfather, no. Our great-great-great-grandfather bought land with his wife that served his children. And his children inherited that land. And one of the sons deeded some of that land to build the first school for Black children in Warren County because the county wasn't going to build a school for Black kids, right? If we didn't do it, no one would. And I think leaning into that idea that, yes, we should demand more from our government and we don't have to wait on them. Our hands are not tied. There's a lot that we can do and achieve as we push and advocate for more.
Oh, I love that answer. Okay, which one am I going to do next? Okay. I want you to say a little bit more about resisting shame, right? Because I love when we were opening, there's something that you said initially that was on my question list. There's so much, especially now with culture the way that it is, with what is put in front of us constantly, there is shame, like, especially in the Black community. I've been in Atlanta, I left for a minute, but like, I was born up the street at Atlanta Medical on Boulevard, which got closed.
I was just about to say,
I still have feelings. Yeah. I'm like, what? Like my birth
certificate records.
Like, am I that old? Wow. But as a kid who grew up in the city, country is like, right? But when we actually take the time to think about it,
it should be, yeah.
Like it should be the opposite.
Yeah.
Like the land was cultivated by us.
Yeah. I mean, everything is intentional and racist in this country.
Yes.
Like you could point to anything and be like, that's anti-Black. And it probably is. Like these floorboards, something about them is not right. And we gotta discuss it and figure it out together.
I can tell you, it's oak.
See,
okay, and
the oak tree. See,
the oak trees was planted on the land that was taken from the Negroes.
There it is. There it is, right there. See, but legitimately, this was so intentionally designed because during the Great Migration, when Black people were fleeing the South, you were being coached by your Black family members who you were meeting. Don't come here and act country.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Don't come here and act backwards.
Yep.
You have to learn how we act up here. You can't come here with overalls and whatever the case may be. You're expected to look the way they look here.
Yep.
And you have to trade out the cultural elements for what life here in Chicago, Oakland, New York, Newark, wherever looks like. And so you see Black people starting to reject things that they've always loved, like chitlins. Like my family is a chitlin eating family. And I didn't realize that was seen as a negative until we went to school, because in New York, a lot of the Black people are Caribbean or, so everybody is from somewhere else, but they're like, chitlins. I'm like, oh, we don't do chitlins? They're like, that's slave food.
I'm not a slave.
Right. I am not a slave and I love it. What does that mean? Oh, we don't eat chitlins anymore? Or even a while back on Twitter, there was this viral tweet and it was asking, younger Black people, would you pick cotton if they were paying $100 an hour? And the amount of people being like, I'd work minimum wage at McDonald's before I pick cotton. I don't care how much they're paying. And it's like, okay, slavery is not getting paid $100 an hour to pick,
hello,
that's good pay. That's really good pay. And so I started digging into that, where does that come from? Or even when Mariah and I got married, we got married on my family's land in North Carolina. And it's just a field of beautiful green. There's nothing that makes you think that it's a plantation. There's no big house or any colonial architecture like that. It's just, we put up a white tent and it was beautiful. And there was one or two comments when I posted it on TikTok about, oh, is this a plantation wedding? Do Black people have And I'm like, so any nature is a plantation. Right. But it's so ingrained. And that's when you realize that oh, you don't want to work in agriculture at all because it feels too reminiscent.
Yeah.
You don't want anything to do with the South or the country because that feels too backwards. And who told us that? Being in the South, being on land is not inherently violent or racist. It's what happened to us on it.
Yes.
And something that I tried to talk about in the book is that the land was not the perpetrator. The land was a fellow victim. At the same time that Black people are being forced to produce unsustainable levels of work, the land is being forced to yield unsustainable levels of harvest, right? And so it's a fellow victim and it's a witness to what happened to us, but the land didn't do it. And so all of the times that I told myself, oh, I don't do that, that's white people stuff, or, that's not something that is for my community. And really, I've been leaning into this lie that was incentivized. And why is that incentivized? Why would you encourage the descendants of the forced laborers to not care about agriculture? Oh, maybe that's because right around the time that Black people were free and able to negotiate for their labor, the U.S. decides we're going to lean on machines. We don't need humans anymore.
Yep.
It's going to be machines and chemicals and tractors and all of this stuff. And now a small farm of parents and 18 kids, where our family comes from, that you can't compete because they've got something that's picking acres in a day and you're still on your second row. And so you realize that when it was profitable, you couldn't get Black people off of land. Literally, we were forced to be on land. And the moment that it became unprofitable for this country, it's okay, y'all can be done with that now. We'll find someone new. Mm-hmm. And the system that they perfected on us is now happening to Chicano and Latino farm workers in places like California and New Mexico and Texas. And it's the same system of let's take your land, make you work it. The moment you try to own it, we'll find someone new to work it, who also doesn't own it, but is happy to get whatever they're getting for a whole crate of straw. You know what I mean? So it's so intentional. Mm-hmm. And if the country could figure out a way to profit from Black people being in nature, we'd be in nature.
Yep.
But if we're doing it for our leisure and our enjoyment and our food and our sustenance, then it's oh, we good off that. And that's when it's more than ever than we deserve to reclaim it.
Damn capitalism, man.
Everything. Okay.
It's in
Everything capitalism.
Everything.
The floorboards again.
Somebody cut a tree down for this wood. I had a whole conversation. This is such a tangent, and I will not make it a long one. But I had a whole conversation the other day about how money is not actually real. Like, we're not gonna go there. But
no,
you
let's
just
go there.
sit on there. Now y'all sit on that one. Because go ahead.
Because I love memes have held me up during this process too. And one of the other funny tweets was that land ownership was the original NFT.
Yes, it sure was.
Because they're like, what do you mean you have a piece of paper that says you own this? Like, you own the grass? And like, now it gets to like
cryptocurrency. Right.
And like, this sounds like a Black Mirror episode, but like, we know that they sell airspace now. Like, how do you own the air to sell me the airspace? Who gave you the air to then, like, it just gets so nonsensical when you really think about it. Like, who said you own that grass and you own that lake and you own the animals that exist on that grass and in that lake? And I think I got, I'm still in that place. And there was a part of me that thought maybe I should title, instead of using Black land ownership in the title, I should use Black land stewardship, because that's really what I'm hoping we all get closer to. Yeah. But I do think that ownership is an important vehicle, because we were sharecroppers and we were stewards. We were enslaved people and we were stewards, and we didn't have control over the land. And ownership is important to being able to control what happens to the land and what happens to us on that land. Right. But hopefully we get land and we treat it differently than those who had it before us.
I love it. And I mean, honestly, if this book is a testament to nothing else, it's to the fact that, like, you got to Trojan horse some stuff sometimes, right? Like, in order to beat the system, you have to know how to navigate it. So, listen, I literally got a t-shirt that says that.
I love
things for me to do this summer. Yeah.
I found
it. Precisely. All right, my last question, and then we'll open up the floor. What kind of ancestor do you want to be?
Wow, I love that. Ooh, I want to be the kind of ancestor that my descendants can turn to and be in conversation with, and feel as though, whether that's through signs in nature, whatever, that I'm speaking back to them, and the kind of ancestor that's really like guiding and ordering steps, just like, okay, you're supposed to be here, and let me put this in your path to make sure you don't lose sight of it. I also think I want to be the kind of ancestor that leaves enough of a record behind, because there's so many of my ancestors that I dream of what they were like. And I just want my descendants to know. And I think Rooted is a really great beginning to that. I love that my future descendants are going to be like, great grandma had chickens and this and that. And maybe, I don't know where the world will be then, how much of that is going to be surprising. But I just want them to feel as though I left enough behind for them that wasn't all like an asset to be liquidated, but just like an heirlooms for them to just find themselves and feel closer to their legacy and just know where they came from.
You want to leave behind a life to be lived. And I think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
You're really smart, which I knew. But like sitting talking to you, I'm like, girl, what were you doing at 30? I am powerfully inspired. You are a beam of sunlight, and I'm so blessed to have been talking to you tonight. Let me open the floor before I start crying, because it's cancer season, and you girl.
As I said, we got the cancers in the room. Yeah.
Who wants to ask the first question? Don't all shout at once.
Hi, friend. What do you think passive activism looks like today for those of us who aren't activists in our professions, I guess?
Okay, so like ways to be activists without it being like your full-time job, essentially.
Yes.
Okay. I love that. I think there's so many ways depending on the issue area, of course, but I do think that everyone jumps to wanting to change the world, right? And starting locally in whatever it is that you're going to do is so much more meaningful, because it's really hard to change the world. I mean, it's really hard to change the country, because even trying to convince the president to, anyway, it's hard. And I think that it can be very jading, and it's easier to quit when you take such a big bite out of something and then you almost like choke on it. And I think it's a lot easier when you realize that there are so many local things that you have control over. So in the context of like this issue area, for example, there are eminent domain reversal cases nationwide that campaigns are active on, trying to get Black families who have their land taken through eminent domain, their land back. Mm-hmm. And a really easy way that costs $0 and maybe like 5 minutes of your time is to go to Where's My Land's Instagram page, and in their bio or on their website are all of their active petitions. And just like going through and signing every single one costs no money, but supports them so much, because a lot of times it's not up to President Biden or senators or anything like that. Bruce's Beach, like that family got their land back because county executives voted to give them their land back. They have another campaign that's about to win in Santa Monica that is successful because city council voted on it. Like these are 13 people you got to convince, like 13 local elected officials who really feel like they might lose their seat if they're not responsive. And so I think that those sorts of things are so meaningful, is figuring out who locally you can support. And like even another example of that, I remember in 2020, I was like back home in Long Island going to a Black Lives Matter protest, and everyone was like, yeah, we're here for George Floyd. And I was like, we are in New York, like NYPD. There are enough victims and victims' families here. And yes, we can still be in solidarity with George Floyd and his family and what they're doing, and continue to sound the alarm. But if we're saying George Floyd's name and we're forgetting about the neighbors down the block who are still fighting since 2010 to get some justice for their loved one, like then we're kind of missing the point, because it's always easier to jump on whatever media is, but keeping sustained local attention is so difficult. So I think just like finding a local organization, and if your support is just checking periodically, signing any of their petitions, a small like dollar amount too, because I promise you, even when I was a Bernie bro, the $27 you would give to a local organization is going to go so much further than any money that you can give to a candidate. And I mean, I hate to say that in election years, like if you were planning on donating, still do that. But like really, it goes so far. You're covering a local community member's salary. You're funding campaigns that will affect local residents, and like, and can touch these people and hear the pain in the fact that they're often fighting alone. So that's one of the best ways to passively support, is just like casual volunteering and periodic like digital activism in support of local organizations, because the Color of Changes and the NAACPs and the ACLUs will continue to get the support from their millions of followers anyway. But the organization that has 600 followers on social media and like depends on like a small number of grants, like a surprise donation changes everything that is possible for their programming, for who they can hire and how much they can compensate community members. So it really does make a difference. Yeah.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, yes. Please, boo.
So another thing that I want to say to everybody in this room, one of the most powerful forms of activism is thriving while Black.
That is so true.
So, and what I mean by that is it's so vital that we each individually get to a space where we are fine being our unapologetic exact self in every space that we enter. Frequently, we will find ourselves in spaces where we are the only one. Yeah. If you are finding yourself in a space where you are the only one, I guarantee you are the best one in that space, because you've had to learn to navigate the system in order to get in the space in the first place. Remembering your power is one of the most beautiful, magnificent, passive forms of activism that there is. I remember being at an event, Ta-Nehisi Coates was talking to a group of high schoolers, and they had no idea what she was talking about, but I'd like snuck in the back. And there was this one point where he said, activism is about agitation. If your presence is bothering somebody, you're probably doing something right. So do that too. Just be, thrive, keep that gorgeous glowing skin, girl. Let them see
it.
Yes. and just own it. Own who you are. Like, get down in yourself and like figure out what needs to be healed. Like the collective trauma, like the shame around slavery comes from trauma, ancestral trauma, plus conditioning. It's like a combination of really nasty things. But yeah, y'all think about what you did to get to where you are and celebrate it.
That's a really good point. Because on that note, I also think like this idea, like there are a lot of activists from previous generations who leaned into martyrdom. And it's like in trying to fight the system, they ended up giving their life to it anyway. So it's still a casualty that the system gets to claim. And I think this idea that if I'm saying Black Lives Matter, for example, does my Black life not matter enough for me to give myself the same thing that I'm fighting for others to have? And I definitely learned that, you know, I have been mentored by an incredible woman named Carmen Perez, who was mentored by an even more incredible man named Harry Belafonte. And there was so much that I learned from him as far as positive examples, but there was also a part of him that I realized that the world got a better side of him than his family did often because he was so committed to the fight. And I was just like, I don't want that to be the story. Like, there are times when I can't be home or where we have to navigate things, but just the idea that the world knows me better and loves me more than my family because I gave my best to the world instead. So I think also just like being able to give your best to you and your loved ones as a Black person is also advocacy for Black life, you know, because if we're not going to give it to ourselves and we all working ourselves to the ground trying to fight for another Black person, then no one's actually enjoying the world we're fighting to give each other.
Whoa. It got hot in here for a second.
Thank you. Hi, Brea.
Hey.
So I really love that you mentioned just like being a younger millennial. I'm cuspy. I'm a younger millennial / older Gen Z. And I feel like in especially this generation and the younger Gen Z generation as well, there's this air of like nihilism and apathy, sort of like there's a lot of information and a lot of passion and care, but there's this sense that like the world is ending and it's over already before we can even like get started. And you've been blessed to have like this legacy of family who have shown you what it looks like to plant a seed and then see it grow over generations. And I'm curious about, like, from your perspective as someone who's been privileged in that way, what it looks like, and not privileged, blessed, what you've been blessed in that way.
It is a privilege.
Yeah. But like, what does it look like? What does it take? What does our generation and our people need right now, or need to tap into right now, in order to be able to really fight for a future that we may never actually see?
Yeah, this is I struggle. Yeah, I'm like, that was good and deep and hard. I mean, I think I try not to blame people for their cynicism because it comes from a real place. Like being born into a world where things like, I mean, so much is happening at the same time, and it's easy to feel as though you don't have a chance to get in. I mean, right now, like a good priced house is like still like far past what, you know what I mean? Like even in a decently priced city, it's really hard to imagine building the sorts of lives that our parents and grandparents made possible. But I do think that belief is that first step. And like, to plant in general is so optimistic, because you don't do that if you don't think there's going to be a tomorrow. Like, why bother planting the seed and watering it? Like that's literally a waste of my time and resources. I might as well drink that all myself. You know, it's why invest in that seed if it's not going to grow into something, and if it's not going to be me to be able to harvest it. I believe that I'm doing it for someone beyond me to be able to do it. So I do think that that is inherently optimistic. And the other thing that I lean into is that pessimism, to me, and I feel confident saying this, is like a white supremacist mindset. Like Black people come from a people that have been hopeful under the worst of circumstances. Like, to continue having children and believing that there is a version of this world where you will not be enslaved, where your descendants will have something that you didn't have. Like the amount of belief that you have to have, even though what you're seeing before you is like the most unbelievable form of violence that you've probably ever been exposed to. And yet you still believe there's got to be something better on the other side. And not the other side in the sense of heaven, because I don't believe in Black people only receiving joy and happiness and safety in heaven. But I do believe that there is a optimism that we have to tap into that is so ancestral, and it's a strength that is going to be beyond us. But it also feels like, who am I not to be optimistic when I literally would not be sitting in this chair writing a book about the things I'm writing about if Black people didn't first rebel and fight and hold on to something. Like, this could have been a book about how there is 0% of farmland, but it's at least enough of a number to say, right, we'll take the little figure and know that it's because someone was optimistic enough to keep trying, and that hopefully we are the proof that it was worth the effort, that we are the like moral arc bending towards justice. Like, maybe someone else didn't see it in their lifetime, but it is going to be enough for them to look down and see their descendants doing it. So I think there's that. And then the last thing I'll say is, just on a more tangible level, is like, if we do everything we've been doing, then yes, we should be pessimistic. There's nothing that can change. But if we take the country by the reins and do something very radically different, a lot can be reversed. And Indigenous nations around the world have shown that reforestation is possible, that cleaning the air and cleaning the water is all possible. We just have to do something different. And I think the idea that it's never going to be different is like us surrendering to, well, humans just inherently are going to have this impact. And it's like, no, humans have lived on this planet for a very long time before the recent stuff that humans have done, as far as like environment, climate change and whatnot. And so we just have to force a different way of being that is kinder to the planet and to the animals and to the environment, and trust that it will be enough. But I mean, the best time to start would have been yesterday. The second best time is today. And so we can each do something more to fight for. My sister, she's gassing me up. I love that you're in the front row, girl.
It ain't gas. It's not gas though. It's real.
Thank you. Yep.
With the eminent domain reversals that are happening in that work, and then some of the stuff that's happening with local reparations movements, do you see those things like working together, blending in their efficacy, or should one, like, if you want to focus on reversing some of the eminent domain stuff, focus on that policy, that advocacy, and reparations is sort of like a parallel path?
That's such a great question. Yeah, I'm very much someone who believes that, like, when I say reparations will happen, and I believe that fully, I don't think that it's going to be like one day the leader of our nation is going to get on a podium and say, we now have reparations. I do think that it'll be a wave of smaller reparations programs, kind of like how they're piloting guaranteed income, if anyone's familiar with that. But they're piloting in different cities, and they're like, okay, a small subset of the population will be able to access it, and we're going to give them checks and follow them and see where it goes, and then we'll invest more if we see it's worth it. And I think it'll start that way, and I hope that it intermingles and that they become seen as supportive of each other, because one of these policies or one of these successful wins in isolation will not be enough. So, for example, to talk about the Bruce's Beach campaign. So, local activists run this campaign, it's successful, and the county decides, because they still own the land that they took, that they're going to give the family back the land that they had taken, and it's beachfront property. Now, when the land was taken from the family, it was beachfront property with a hotel on top of it. And what they were returned was just the property. So there's no immediate way to profit from this land. Like, it's not farmland, so you can't like put something in the ground immediately and sell that. There's no home to live on or anything. So it was a win in some ways, and I honor it as a win. But if policy were working with that campaign, they should have gotten a property tax exemption until they were able to get buildings back on that land, or until they were able to turn a profit from it, because what they got was a tax burden. So they inherited this land. It's worth $20 million. And this working class Black family is expected to pay property taxes annually in California on land that is worth $20 million. So in less than a year, they ended up having to sell the land back to the county. Now, people were frustrated at that, and it is a disservice, because in an ideal world, they get to keep their land, and it's this, they ride off into the sunset and the land is theirs. I mean, it's still a win that they were able to sell their property and get like the dollar amount for it, as opposed to it just be taken through eminent domain. But yeah, they inherited something that they and the community were so excited to have back in the family, and then realized that they didn't have the resources to keep it. And that's an example where, as eminent domain reversals are happening, I believe that legislators should be introducing policy around property tax exemptions, not just for those who are just now getting their land back with eminent domain, but in general. I think there's a lot of Black families who have lost their land through property taxes that they've not been able to afford, who have been struggling deeply because of property taxes. And I think exemptions would allow for us to actually bridge some racial wealth divides, as opposed to the land being more, it's almost like, not that it's a punishment, but it is a burden, because it's like, if I can't afford to keep it, then why have it in the first place? So that's one policy that I'd love to see. And then in the reverse is appraisals, because Black families pay more than they should in property taxes, but get less than they should when it's time to sell their land because of how it's appraised. So changing that code, I think there's a lot of legislation that should happen in tandem, as we're giving families their land back as well. And as we're pursuing things like baby bonds and direct checks and direct investments in HBCUs. But it shouldn't be any one of those things in isolation. If someone gets up and is like, we're going to do reparations and we're going to make a check to these 5 HBCUs, that's not reparations. Now, not alone, at least. Now, the institutions do deserve support too, but that can't be the only thing. So I think it really should be so much more multi-pronged. And that's also why Black people should be at the helm of this, because we know these things. We know how hard it is to hold on to land and what's standing in the way of it. But when a room of 100 senators, and how many of them are white men, are getting together, they, if they're going to give us reparations, it's going to look very different than what we'd advocate for ourselves. So I think as we fight for local families to get their land returned, we should also push for legislation to be introduced to make it easier for those families to keep the land. And that's where I think more multiracial coalitions can come in, because that kind of policy would benefit everyone. Yeah. Across Appalachia, there are working class white families that are also struggling with these same issues. Farm working families across the Southwest who should be indigenous to this land, but are being treated as immigrants. And so I think that we can have conversations about the way these policies would benefit all of us. Thank you for that.
You better, girl.
Yeah.
One more.
So we like to close it out with a question about, we think about books in context on their shelves, both literally, but also metaphorically. So if you had your ideal bookshelf with your book ancestors, your book can be in its rightful place among other books. This is not a time to be humble. Where do you want your books? Who else is on your shelf with you?
Oh, I love this question.
I love this question too. Okay, definitely Isabel Wilkerson's books are up there. Amani Perry's books are up there, especially Warmth of Other Suns and then South to America. Those 2 books would be probably sandwiching it. Anything by Robin D.G. Kelley, especially Hammer and Hoe, would be up there. Books from the South, whether it's poetry, novels, Toni Morrison's Sula also covers land theft in a fictional town. So all of those sorts of works would be there. And then, okay, man, I could go on and on about this. Okay, the last few authors I'd say is there need to be Jessamine Ward, James Baldwin, and and Bell Hooks.
Ooh,
that's a shelf right there.
Kentuckian.
So we are going to say goodnight to our virtual friends. Thank y'all so much for watching with us tonight. You can click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Rooted from Charis. Really help us when you buy books from us. Thank you so much.